Good morning, everybody. Buenos dias. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I want to welcome everyone on behalf of the Inter-American Dialogue and also the Inter-American Development Bank. Dialogue is very happy to partner once again with the IDB on this symposia series to take stock of efforts to combat corruption in the Americas, to identify the lessons that have been learned, and distill practical policy solutions. Last month, we kicked off the series with a terrific event on comparative corruption prosecutions. And if anybody missed that and would like to see the video, we have it on our website. Today, this morning, we delve into the theme of political finance, an issue at the heart of many of the recent grand corruption scandals in the region, which saw millions of dollars of kickbacks diverted in political campaigns. There's no politics without money, of course, but campaign finance without limits or transparency can corrode democracy and open the door to state capture by special interests. The infrastructure industry in particular, dependent as it is on lucrative government procurement contracts, has proven a recurrent source of illicit campaign contributions. So we will ask whether this is a problem of defective regulation or one of enforcement. Does Latin America need a new approach to campaign finance? And what lessons, either positive or negative, can be learned from jurisdictions such as the United States? Once again, we're extremely fortunate to have an outstanding panel of some of the hemisphere's leading experts on this issue. Kevin Casas-Zamora, who will be introduced more fully, but I just want to mention that he is a non-resident senior fellow at the Inter-American Dialogue, so he's kind of coming back home here, and it's great to see him. Delia Ferreira, Eduardo Engel, and Ravel. Michael Camilleri, who is the director of our Rule of Law program, who's done an absolutely fabulous job and has been coordinating this series, will moderate the discussion, and he will formally introduce all of you, all of our great panelists. We're very grateful for the opportunity to collaborate with the IDB on this, and I'm very happy to introduce a good friend and also the monetization of the state principal specialist at the IDB to help frame today's discussion, Roberto Di Michele. Roberto will speak in Spanish, and our panelists will speak in a combination of English and Spanish. So please make use of the headsets for translation if you need them. So with that, it's a pleasure to introduce Roberto Di Michele. Roberto.
Gracias, Michael. Buenos días a todos. Ante el frío de Washington traemos un tema caliente. Muchísimas gracias por la introducción. También para el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo es un placer poder trabajar con el diálogo interamericano y tener la posibilidad de tratar posiblemente uno de los temas centrales para la sostenibilidad de la democracia en la región y en el resto del mundo. Antes del panel de hoy releí dos cosas. Uno, el trabajo de Michael Sandel, The Moral Limits of Markets, What Money Can't Buy. Es un libro realmente muy interesante porque justamente nos plantea o nos enfrenta a aquellos supuestos en los que creemos que el dinero realmente no llega, y cuando uno empieza a analizar hasta dónde llega el mercado y hasta dónde llega el dinero, se sorprende que en realidad tiene mucha más fuerza y mucho más poder de lo que a veces suponemos. Y el segundo, el trabajo que Delia y Eduardo participaron, que es el informe del Grupo Asesor de Transparencia y Anticorrupción e Integridad del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, que también toca muy especialmente el tema de la financiación de la política. ¿Y por qué creo que nos motiva y nos preocupa este tema? Porque si el supuesto principal de un sistema democrático es que todos somos iguales ante la ley, que no importa nuestras condiciones materiales o personales, al final del día, frente al sistema político, cada persona un voto y ese voto es el que cuenta. Sin embargo, vemos cotidianamente, como decía Michael, que el dinero tiene una influencia indebida frente a las decisiones de la política. y eso termina degradando la calidad de la democracia. Y cuando se degrada la calidad de la democracia, los ciudadanos pierden confianza en el gobierno. Cuando se pierde confianza en el gobierno, las instituciones se debilitan, la estabilidad política se disminuye, la legitimidad del Estado se pierde y vienen los problemas que todos conocemos. Por supuesto, esto es mucho más fácil de describir que de resolver, y para eso tenemos el panel de especialistas que hemos traído hoy, que es realmente excelente. El tema tiene una paradójica virtud, que es nunca va a salir de moda, como la corrupción. Acabamos de pasar elecciones muy recientes en nuestra región y ya tenemos un nuevo ciclo electoral. Panamá, Guatemala, Argentina van a tener elecciones dentro de poco y este tema está muy presente en esa agenda. Así que espero y estoy seguro que la participación de ustedes nos va a ayudar a pensar mejor cómo enfrentar este tema. Muchas gracias.
To partner with you and the IDB on the Symposia series and on this event. As I think both Michael and Roberto mentioned, we are delving a little deeper into the story, the corruption story today, and looking at how some of the recent scandals have occurred and how they might be prevented in the future. The Argentine investigative journalist Hugo Alconada Mon, who's done a lot of very good work on Lavallato, calls political finance the original sin. And it does turn out that much of the dirty money from some of the biggest Latin American corruption scandals of recent years, including Petrobras and Odebrecht, was in fact funneled into political campaigns. These scandals reveal a criminal symbiotic relationship between politicians who need money for their campaigns and business leaders, especially in the corruption in the construction industry, who need lucrative government contracts. So everybody wins in these deals, except, of course, for the public. Our panelists are really ideally situated to take on this issue, to help us understand how the phenomenon works, why it exists, and how it might be addressed. So let me just briefly introduce them, and we'll jump into the conversation. To my immediate left, Delia Ferreira is the Global Chair of Transparency International. To my right, Eduardo Engel is a professor of economics at the Universidad de Chile and a former president of Espacio Público. Both Delia and Eduardo were part of the expert advisory group that Roberto mentioned, which produced a really terrific report for the IDB that I think we have copies of outside, but certainly commend for your reading. Kevin Casas Zamora, senior fellow here at the Dialogue, former vice president of Costa Rica, former secretary of political affairs at the OAS, and also the founding director of the Dialogue's Rule of Law program. And I'm internally in his debt for all the work that he did there and the big shoes that he left to fill, and really kind of putting the program on the map on this issue. So great to have you back, Kevin. And Ann Ravel, professor at the University of Berkeley Law School, also a former member of the Federal Election Commission here in the United States. So wonderful, again, to have you all here, and looking forward to this terrific conversation. So we're going to start with some introductory remarks from each of our panelists, and then we'll jump into a conversation. Of course, leave plenty of time for your questions and comments. And I want to just start with Delia, maybe for an overview of kind of what we're seeing in the region and how we should be thinking about it, and we'll go from there. Delia, welcome.
Gracias, Michael. Gracias al Diálogo y al Banco por la invitación. Y es un honor estar en este panel con gente que venimos trabajando este tema desde hace muchísimos años, porque realmente es un tema que está siempre presente y tiene que ver con la calidad de la democracia, como dijo Roberto de Michele. Por eso es que estamos trabajando dinero y política, no es que tengamos una curiosidad malsana para saber quién financia a quién, sino quién financia a quién y quién está detrás de los candidatos o de los partidos, según el sistema, determina la calidad de la democracia, la credibilidad de los discursos, la posibilidad de valorar la gestión de gobierno, saber si las decisiones y las políticas públicas son pago de favores o están orientadas realmente al bien común. Y la conversación tiene que ver con la corrupción, por eso voy a empezar por contarles a los que no hayan visto el último índice de percepción de corrupción de Transparencia Internacional, que se publica anualmente y mide la percepción que expertos académicos y el sector público tiene sobre, y el sector privado tiene sobre el sector público de los países. Ese índice coloca a Latinoamérica incluso por debajo del promedio general en el mundo, e incluso si lo consideramos a las Américas como continente, Latinoamérica está por debajo de ese promedio, con 36 puntos sobre 100 posibles. Solo hay 3 países que están por encima de la media, la escala es de 100, percibido como transparente, 0, percibido como altamente corrupto, y solo hay 3 países latinoamericanos que están por encima de los 50 puntos, Chile con 67, Uruguay con 70 y Costa Rica con 56 en la última medición. Todos los demás, incluido Argentina, estamos muy por debajo de ese score. Eso significa que en la región, y no hemos advertido ningún progreso desde el año 2012, cuando el índice, que ya tiene 20 años, cambió su metodología para poder hacer seguimiento año a año, no ha habido realmente ningún progreso en la región en ese punto. Y ese contexto de corrupción es lo que genera el escenario donde el tema de financiamiento de la política ingresa en la agenda pública. Y me parece que lo interesante, porque el tema ha estado siempre presente, es ver qué cosas han cambiado en la última década en materia de corrupción, afectando el financiamiento de la política. Y creo que esos cambios determinan que las herramientas que hemos usado durante más de 30 años para enfrentar el problema de dinero y política, o el principal problema que habíamos diagnosticado en ese entonces, que era la captura del Estado por parte de grandes grupos económicos, esas herramientas y ese principal problema ya no son el centro de la agenda. ¿Por qué? Porque las herramientas que estaban pensadas para enfrentar ese problema no son las aptas para enfrentar los problemas nuevos. Entre esos problemas o situaciones nuevas, la gran corrupción que mencionaban tanto Michael como Roberto como Michael recién, es el escenario nuevo en la región. No porque antes no hubiera casos de gran corrupción, sino porque ahora se conocen. Y lo particular es que las investigaciones ahora en muchos de nuestros países están llevadas adelante, no por los organismos de control electoral y del financiamiento de la política, sino por tribunales criminales que analizan el tema de los casos de gran corrupción y los vinculan inmediatamente con el financiamiento de la política. Eso supone otras normas de procedimiento, otras reglas de evidencia y otra capacidad de acción. La gran corrupción, como ustedes saben, es un mecanismo sistemático en el que la corrupción se transforma en el modo ordinario de hacer negocios entre el sector privado y el sector público. Esa es la forma normal y eso es lo que justifica que el sector privado se organiza en carteles o clubs, como se los conoce en la región, el club de la obra pública, el club de la infraestructura, el club de los contratos que tienen que ver con agua. Y ese mecanismo hace que, en realidad, el dinero que entra a la política dejó de ser dinero privado. Lo que tenemos en los casos de gran corrupción es un canal paralelo de financiamiento de la política, particularmente beneficioso para el gobierno de turno, para el partido que está en el gobierno, que proviene de fondos públicos. Porque la gran corrupción se ha caracterizado en la región, Petrobras, Odebrecht, la línea en Guatemala o el caso de los cuadernos en Argentina, el mecanismo se caracteriza por sobreprecios. Cada contrato incluye en Argentina entre un 20 y un 40% del costo original en sobreprecio. Y el sobreprecio es recibido por la empresa que gana el concurso, que está en el club correspondiente, y se compromete a lavar ese dinero y retornarlo al gobierno que otorga el contrato. Esto no significa que todo ese dinero vaya a financiamiento de la política. Este es un mecanismo permanente. En muchas instancias va directamente al enriquecimiento ilícito de algunos funcionarios. En tiempos de campaña, ese dinero puede derivar o terminar en el financiamiento de las campañas, pero es otra vez dinero público. Y el hecho de que sea una situación de win-win es lo que explica que el mecanismo se haya establecido como regla en la región, porque el empresario o la empresa no sacan dinero de su bolsillo, ganan el contrato con la ganancia normal correspondiente y ganan la comisión por el servicio de lavar el dinero. Entonces, ese actor que antes era el actor donante, el que hacía la contribución, hoy es un facilitador de la corrupción, que trabaja para el gobierno limpiando el dinero del presupuesto público que se sacó y va a entrar luego en el circuito de la corrupción. Y esto cambia completamente el panorama de lo que pueden y deben hacer los organismos de control del financiamiento de la política. El segundo elemento que ha cambiado el panorama en la región, en Latinoamérica, es la introducción de dinero procedente del crimen organizado en el financiamiento de la política. Cuando el crimen organizado financia las campañas, los riesgos que se corren van mucho más allá que la simple compra o venta de decisiones políticas. Está en riesgo la libertad, la seguridad, las libertades esenciales y la vida misma de muchos ciudadanos. Y eso lo estamos viendo en la región. Con un condimento extra, que es que en los últimos 20 años, el crimen organizado cambió su estrategia de financiamiento de la política, de compra de decisión política para proteger su actividad, y lo bajó desde el nivel nacional al nivel sublocal, a las municipalidades, y este nivel local es mucho más difícil de controlar por el organismo que controla el financiamiento de la política, es menos visible, es menos expuesto, es más barato financiar la campaña de un intendente que la campaña de un presidente, y eso es mucho más productivo para el cartel o la organización criminal en cualquiera de las, comillas, industrias del crimen organizado, sea el tráfico de productos naturales o el narcotráfico o la trata de personas, en cualquiera de los rubros. Es mucho más conveniente tener copado el gobierno local en los lugares por donde circula la mercadería que tener copado al presidente de la República. Eso fue antes, se probó en la región, recordarán el caso de Samper en Colombia, esa campaña estuvo financiada y probadamente financiada por los carteles, y eso ya hoy no lo vemos. Lo que vemos es muchas campañas locales financiadas por el crimen organizado. Esto es más difícil de controlar, menos visible, más rendidor, y además puede ser presentado fácilmente o justificado fácilmente por las autoridades, porque el problema del crimen organizado es tan grande que el Estado tiene tan pocos recursos en comparación y entonces no puede enfrentarse porque tiene que priorizar otras cosas. Y por contar una anécdota que siempre cuento, en cadena nacional, un presidente de la región anunció que para luchar contra el narcotráfico había radarizado la frontera del país. Pero como no tenían mucho presupuesto, habían comprado radares móviles que operarían de 8 a 12 en esta zona, de 12 a 16 en esta zona, de 16 a 20 en esta zona. De noche no operaban, obviamente porque no había para pagar dinero extra a los operadores. Ese es el segundo elemento que caracteriza el financiamiento de la política hoy en la región. Las investigaciones han sumado un nuevo elemento que estaba completamente ausente y es la sanción a gente de empresa, a grandes líderes de empresa. La gran corrupción no se da entre pequeñas personas, se da entre los líderes de los países y los líderes del sector empresario. Y estos empresarios, por primera vez en la región, han tenido que ir a tribunales, han sido sancionados, algunos han tenido que pasarse algunos días en prisión, no muchos, pero algunos, y eso es muy determinante para cuán colaborador uno es, y han tenido que retornar los fondos que habían sacado de los países y en algunos casos pagar ingentes compensaciones que hoy se usan para distintos fines de política pública según el acuerdo que cada país pueda hacer. Esto ha determinado un cambio de actitud por parte del sector privado en las campañas que vienen. No se había notado hasta ahora, pero ahora se está notando en los países donde se ha tratado de poner coto a la impunidad, y es un nuevo elemento que es lo reticente que está el sector privado a colaborar en las campañas, aún para dar las aportaciones legales, transparentes, con recibo y dentro de los límites de la ley. ¿Por qué? Porque saben que hoy corrupción y financiamiento de la política están en la mira de la justicia, y la justicia en muchos países ha avanzado. Último elemento antes de dejarle al resto de los panelistas, que me parece que hay que señalar en la región, es la importancia de la reacción social. En muchos países la sociedad ha salido a reclamar transparencia. En muchos países esto ha determinado la caída de presidentes o vicepresidentes. En algunos países ese apoyo de la sociedad ha sido determinante para la labor de los jueces que estaban investigando corrupción, como el caso de Moro o el fiscal Janot en Brasil, o de la CICIG en Guatemala. Entonces, ese nuevo elemento que muestra un poco el hartazgo de la sociedad es un elemento nuevo que habría que capitalizar, y yo creo que hay mucho para hacer desde la sociedad civil. Y lo dejo acá. Gracias.
Habrá tiempo para aplausos, no se preocupen. Bueno, Delia, muchas gracias. Fantástico. It's an excellent overview, great way to get us started. Let me turn next to Eduardo.
First of all, thanks to the dialogue and to the IDB for this invitation. Let me spend my first 8 minutes. Is that better? Let me spend my first 8 minutes providing some new data. So with my two co-authors of many years, Ronnie Fisher and Alex Skeletovic, and a young researcher at Espacio Público, Nicolas Campos, we spent the last 6 months going through all the information that has been revealed through the Odebrecht case. Close to 100 plea bargains, more than 1,000 press reports. I mean, we've used all the new technologies of web scraping to see if the data is consistent with the anecdotes we have based our policies on for many decades. And we have a recent paper circulating, and let me go through the 5 main facts, and then eventually, and if I don't have the time now, later I'll make the connection to the topic we're at today. So the first fact is that, and I should say this very carefully, but bribes were relatively small. According to the plea bargain with the DOJ, Odebrecht paid approximately $800 million in bribes. The businesses Odebrecht had during the period of this plea bargain are above $150 billion. So this is like 0.5%. Second, the profits made by Odebrecht, and again I should say this very carefully, were relatively small when you compare them to investments. Under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, Odebrecht was fined initially $4.6 billion, and Odebrecht convinced them that if they were forced to pay that, they would go bankrupt, and the fine was reduced to $2.5 billion. Again, huge amounts for every one of us compared to $150 billion, a little more than 1%. Next fact is we looked at the 90 projects Odebrecht was involved in 8 Latin American countries, all of them except Venezuela and Brazil. Venezuela because there's just no reliable data these days, and Brazil because the number is just way too large to analyze. But we looked at the other 8 countries where Odebrecht paid bribes. We looked at all the projects, those where they paid and where they did not pay bribes, and had all the evidence on whether they paid or not and the amounts. If you take approximately the half of projects where Odebrecht did not pay a bribe, There are renegotiations so that initially if you invest 100, you end up investing more than 100. In fact, on average, it goes up by 6.5%. So you go from 100 to 106.5. If you take the other half where a bribe was paid, it goes from 100 to 171. So in projects where bribes are paid, you have renegotiations of an average of 71%. In projects with no bribes, you have a 6.5%. Fact number 4, and I'll say this like economists would like to say it, and I know there's a bit of an irony here. Odebrecht was an innovator in the bribing business. It created the division of structured operations, which was a major leap in the efficiency with which you pay bribes. It had 7 individuals full-time into paying the bribes. It created a special system. It provided for bribe recipients a bank subsidiary in Antigua of an Austrian bank, which was owned by Odebrecht. I mean, it did the 2 things which are the main challenge when you bribe someone. 1, avoid leakage. Look at Argentina, where the Caso de los Cuadernos is a case where you have a lot of leakage, where you had a taxi driver traveling to Buenos Aires and a lot of money would get lost on the way. In the case of Odebrecht, not a single cent got lost, and that was a major improvement. And number 2, it provided for the bribe recipient a lot of security. You were not forced to run in the middle of the night with a big bag full of money and throw it into a convent where none was there to receive it, as happened also in Buenos Aires, but instead the money was safe, or you thought it would be safe, in some tax haven. And number 5, let me illustrate number 5 through an actual auction. When the metro line number 1 in Lima was auctioned, the winner would be decided by a combination of 2 factors: a technical assessment of the competitors and an economic offer. The technical assessment, it's not a great idea because there's subjective elements in there, so Odebrecht bribed the officials to make sure they'll get 100 there, which was the maximum, and would sort of outperform their competitors. The competitor got a little less. But Odebrecht still made the best economic offer, which was totally objective. So this was sort of the nervous briber because they were bribing, but in a very competitive market. It was not, and Odebrecht would have won without paying the bribe in that case and the other cases actually too. So in the end, we have Odebrecht was a very effective briber in a relatively competitive market where we know now all of the firms were bribing. Now, what happened before and after the creation of the Division of Structured Operations? Before this creation, Odebrecht was one of many players with not a much larger participation than the rest. After the creation, Odebrecht's share of the market, its sales, skyrocketed. They multiplied by a factor of 10, but its profits remained low. Odebrecht did not make much more money after than before the creation of DSO. So at least to us, most of the facts I just said were important surprises. I mean, pretty much all of them, okay? Now let me try to make a brief connection, and you should stop me when I reach my 8 minutes, as to what are the implications of this for the question at hand today about political finance. There's got to be a more efficient way of financing our politics. Definitely, the way it is being done has had a huge negative impact on economies in the region. Economies have been brought to a standstill in many projects with a lot of losses for small enterprises with nothing to do with the bribes, for the economy as a whole, for the deterioration in confidence in democracy overall in the region, for what compared to the amounts involved in these businesses was relatively small money. Politics needs financing to have good politics, and we must think of how we do this, but there's got to be much more effective ways of doing it than having it being done through these corrupt practices, which like what we've seen in particularly in the infrastructure sector. It's a very inefficient way of putting money in the hand of politicians. And let me go from here to something completely different, and then I'll stop which is recent reforms in Chile in how political finance takes place. So Chile had some, for Chilean standards, big corruption scandals in 2014 and 2015. This opportunity led to the creation of a commission, which I had the honor of presiding, which made proposals, which then were the basis for Bachelet proposals to Congress, and Congress finally approved many of the proposals we made. Essentially, it is about much healthier financing of politics, together with much more regulation and transparency in political parties. Okay? So the unpopular part here was, for example, there's government money now for political parties in Chile. There never was a penny before. In exchange for that, parties must act much more democratically. Their internal dynamics were very undemocratic and opaque and the like. You have then government money now for parties in terms of campaign finance. The public component increased. The private component, very much in line with what Delia was saying, has gone down because people are afraid to donate. Nonetheless, the number of donors in Chile increased from approximately 1,000 in the last congressional presidential election before these scandals to 7,000 with the new method. So the number of people is still small compared to the US, but it's a sevenfold increase in terms of the number of people who contributed to politics. Nowadays, unless it's a very small donation, they're all public, and we have, therefore, a new regime going on. We have that political parties have been forced to elect their officials, to have transparent elections. There's a transition going on there. They have a certain period of time to do this. They've complained a lot, but it has worked. Campaigns are much more in the European or American way, in the sense that you don't have a city full of signs all over the place with pretty much no information. Parties complained bitterly about this. There was a whole campaign that there was no electoral atmosphere in their place because you do not have all these huge cartels all over the place signaling the names and nothing else about different candidates. There was a poll run by Ipsos and Espacio Público showing that 88% of people supported the new rules, so then there was no more complaints about this, and parties have come to terms with the new rules of the game. So there's a transition towards something that is working better in terms of financing, which has a larger component from government money. Government monies are based essentially on your performance in elections, so it's not that you get money at any event. There's small amounts for starting parties, possibly too little because it was incumbents who made a decision on how much they would get when this was legislated. But there are the safeguards you want, so not to have too much money for parties. And I think it is a major move in the right direction. And finally, let me close the circle. What I think is the lesson from what we're seeing in this data on Odebrecht is that despite all the criticisms we have made progress in having the multilaterals like the IDB, like the World Bank, like others, putting a lot of pressure on countries in having competitive auctions for infrastructure projects. And not all of them, but most projects nowadays in Latin America are adjudicated with competitive auctions. What is missing is to take a careful look at what happens after a contract is given to a company. What happens in the post-bid. There we have very little work going on, renegotiations, there's very little information on the web, there's very little follow-up on what happens later. It is there we must focus our efforts in terms of regulations, in terms of governance, and improving the post-adjudication governance of infrastructure contracts. We want to reduce this source of corruption we have seen in many countries in the region. And then this must go hand in hand with the demand which is going to be there for political finance and how we channel that demand in a more healthy manner.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Eduardo. Kevin, Eduardo mentioned the need to find a better way, a more effective way of financing politics in the region. You've thought a lot about this, including in an excellent book you wrote called The Cost of Democracy. So maybe give us your thoughts on where we are and what the reform agenda looks like.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be back, and it's great to share this this panel with such a distinguished group of of experts. And thank you also to the Inter-American Development Bank for paying attention to this issue, really. I mean, that's a big change in itself. I mean, when Delia and I and a few others started working on this, like, I don't know, 25 years ago, it was kind of an arcane subject. I mean, it was very much, you know, on the margins of political science. It just sort of moved to the mainstream, and that's good news. I'm going to say a couple of things about what has happened with political finance in Latin America in the past, and then I'm going to say something about what needs to happen as I see it. But before I do that, I can resist saying something about what has been said already on the panel. You know, I always get a little anxious when, in a way, we start equating political finance with corruption. And we start sort of conflating political donations and bribes as though they were the same thing. And they are not. They are not. And actually, one can make a very different kind of argument, which goes like this. And I'll start by telling an anecdote here, which is a real anecdote from a few years ago in Panama. Well, you know, it turns out that there was this big project in the free zone of Colón that the Legislative Assembly in Panama had to vote to approve the contract. And the firm that won the bid had contributed to the campaigns of several of the political parties represented in the assembly. So when that became public, a lot of people started saying and wagging their finger, you know, that's exactly the reason why, you know, they won the bid. Well, it turns out that they had also bribed like 2/3 of the assembly in order to get the contract. I think that's a very instructive example of how political finance might not get you what you want. In actual fact, my impression is that the more evidence you have of bribing, the less relevant political finance is as a way to purchase political influence. And think about this. Think about this for a second. I mean, if you're a businessman in Nigeria, why on earth would you care about purchasing political influence through political finance? You go and bribe. So the practical implication of this, of what I'm saying, is that I have the hunch, and I've had it for a long time, I just haven't been able to test it. Perhaps Eduardo can help me with that. I have the hunch that the more evidence you see of bribing and straight up corruption, the less relevant political finance is as a means to buy political influence. Therefore, political finance is probably less relevant in Nigeria than in Costa Rica, and less relevant in Costa Rica than in Germany. Right? Anyway, it's a testable hypothesis, you know, and I would invite all of you, you know, if you like this kind of stuff, to engage in this kind of research. I mean, all I'm trying to say is that this notion that political finance equals bribing and should be conflated with bribing is problematic, it seems to me. Now, what has happened with political finance over the past few years in Latin America? Well, the first thing that needs to be said is that Latin America has a long tradition of enacting political finance rules. The region has been a pioneer in public funding, for instance. Think about the fact that public funding systems for political parties were introduced in Uruguay in 1928, whereas the first Western European country that did so was Germany in 1959. So, we started out early in terms of regulating political finance. And generally speaking, over all these decades of regulating political finance, we've created in the region normative frameworks which, give and take, are not bad. They can be held up to international standards. I mean, most countries ban anonymous donations. Most countries ban, foreign donations. I mean, they are not bad. I mean, you can find exceptions, of course, but generally speaking, they're not bad. The single biggest problem, and not just in Latin America, is lack of enforcement of those normative frameworks. And to cut to the chase, whatever the laws in the books say, we just don't know who pays for campaigns in Latin America. That's the bottom line. Why is it that political finance regulation has become relevant precisely now in Latin America? I would say there are three reasons for that. I mean, number one, we have more competitive elections than ever before that probably place more financial demands on political actors than ever before. The second thing is that our intense interest in political finance is also a result of democratic consolidation. Political finance regulation is a kind of a sophisticated issue. When we were dealing with democratic transitions a generation ago in Latin America, I mean, who cares about political finance? I mean, you care about setting up decent electoral roles. You care about being able to celebrate, transparent and periodical elections in your country. I mean, political finance is like, it's a luxury, in that sort of context. Well, not anymore. I think the level of democratic consolidation in the region has meant that we turn our attention to this kind of more sophisticated issue. It's kind of a second-generation political reform. And number three, and this was alluded to by Delia rightly, we have seen a very significant increase in transparency levels in the region. And Miguel, my good friend, Dr. Miguel Carter, and I wrote a report a couple of years ago that, among other things, showed that the work that has been done by Latin American countries in terms of introducing norms, standards, institutions that tend to increase transparency and accountability levels has been simply extraordinary. So, and this body of normative work that has been done is starting to have an effect. It's starting to have an impact on, on the way these things get to be known, and in terms of giving new prerogatives to judges, to prosecutors, to journalists, to citizens. So the practical result of that increase in transparency has been exactly what we are seeing, a string of high-level corruption scandals, some of which have a political finance element in them. Okay? What has happened over the past few years? I mean, number one, as we have mentioned here, a string of corruption scandals in Brazil. Very surprisingly, I have to say, in Chile, which was the effective reason why they undertook what I think is a phenomenal reform effort. In Honduras, and then the mother of all scandals with regional implications, Odebrecht. Okay? The second thing that has happened over the past few years, and Delia had it, right on, spot on, in what she said, is that the weakness of the local level has become increasingly evident. I mean, the local level, particularly in terms of the danger of organized crime penetrating politics, the local level is the weakest link of the chain. And this has become a growing and visible concern in countries like Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, Peru, Central American countries, all over the place. And in that respect, one of the single most interesting and compelling documents that have come out over the past few years on political finance in Latin America is a report that CICIG, the International Commission Against Corruption and Impunity in Guatemala, put out in 2015. It makes for great reading, because basically what they show in a fairly compelling way is that probably 75% of funding for political parties in Guatemala comes from illicit sources of different kinds, including organized crime. And most of it happens at the local level. And most of it happens connected to, what doesn't come from organized crime comes from illicit schemes of different sorts connected to public works. All right? The third thing that has happened over the past few years is that we've seen in Latin America a flurry of new, tougher rules to regulate political finance. More rigorous controls over donations, including, and this is interesting, a number of countries that are starting to ban corporate donations. Costa Rica did that, I think, very effectively in 2009. Brazil did it. Chile, in the new reform, did it. We're seeing efforts to individualize accountability for political finance donations, which is a big issue. It's sort of replicating what the Brits have done for a long time. The figure of the electoral agent, someone who takes personal responsibility for complying with political finance regulations. We're sort of adopting the same principle. We're seeing this in Paraguay, in the last political finance reform in Guatemala. We're seeing more severe penalties in the case of political finance violations, including for the first time electoral sanctions, which is something that countries like France, Canada have had for a long time. In Chile these days, an election can be overturned if it's shown that the winning candidate violated in a blatant way political finance regulations. The same thing in Mexico. We're seeing media access rules being reformed in ways that try to rein in electoral spending, basically by banning paid advertising while granting free access to media. The whole issue of las franjas electorales, as they are called in Latin America. This is something that has been done for a long time in places like Brazil, Mexico, Chile, but now it was adopted in Ecuador, now it was adopted in Guatemala as well. And we're seeing something that is very interesting. For the first time, we're adopting a kind of holistic approach towards regulating political finance. And by this I mean the kind of thing that we saw in Chile, that you try to regulate political finance, but at the same time, you guys understood that in order to be effective to deal with political finance, you also had to regulate lobbying practices, you also had to regulate conflicts of interest, you also had to regulate a number of peripheral things so as to create a kind of ecosystem to protect integrity in the public sector. Now, I mean, this is all good. What's the glaring flaw of all this? Well, that we don't really know if these controls are being enforced. And actually, Delia mentioned something that is very telling, which is that the political finance violations that are being uncovered in Latin America in all these different scandals were uncovered by tax and judicial authorities and by journalists. Not really as a result of applying political finance controls. And I guess the practical implication of this is that, you know, having a specialized unit in your electoral authority typically dealing with political finance goes some way towards effective enforcement. And that is not being done in the region. A little bit was done in Honduras as a result of the work of the OAS mission, but little else. I'll finish in 1 minute with the second part, and we can go, you know, at some length during the Q&A, which is what needs to happen, in my opinion. I mean, first thing, we need to focus more intently on enforcement, particularly, you know, building capacities, legal, financial, human capacities at electoral authorities that deal with enforcement of political finance rules. Number two, pay attention to the local level by all means, because that's the weakest link in the chain. Number three, try to enlist civil society, and particularly when I talk about this, one of the interesting things that is happening in the region is that civil society has become very clever in terms of developing digital applications that help with reporting political finance income and expenses. And the key exhibit of this is Cuentas Claras in Colombia, I mean, which was a digital application developed by Transparencia Colombia, which was eventually donated to the electoral authority and was made compulsory by the electoral authority. That kind of thing is happening in different places. So try to enlist civil society and try to develop, together with civil society, digital applications that help with reporting practices. And number four, and I go back to the case of Chile, and not only Chile, embrace a holistic approach. I mean, Latin America's recent corruption scandals are very complex schemes in which political finance fraud is only one element in a larger story of corruption. And this explains Chile's decision to embed political finance reform in a broader set of integrity-enhancing reforms. And this explains Guatemala's recently introduced reforms forcing banking and telecoms authorities to share relevant financial information with electoral authorities. So if political finance rules are to be effective in protecting democratic institutions, their connections to other norms that lie at the periphery of political finance must be understood. The idea is to have political finance regulation as part of this ecosystem of integrity-enhancing rules. And all these things are crucial. You know, it's really of the essence that we take this, this agenda seriously. I mean, the role of money in politics must be effectively regulated, regardless of what the U.S. Supreme Court would like to think. Money is not speech. Money is power. And power needs to be subject to limits if we want a democracy to remain a democracy. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you for those great remarks, and thank you also for the perfect transition to Anne's comments on what's happening stateside and what we might take away from it. Anne, over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's really good to be here. I think we have a lot to learn from one another, and a lot of things are actually that we have in common that can make a difference. Let me first respond to what Eduardo said about corruption and campaign contributions, because I actually agree that giving contributions per se is not corrupting. And I don't like the designation of corruption when people talk about it that way, because it reduces trust in government and government officials in a way that I think is destructive. On the other hand, money can be, and the United States is a really good example of this, corrupting of the system generally. And what we see in the United States, and let me talk about that generally. There's been studies by Professors Gillens, who has looked at every federal government policy, every federal government law, every federal government regulation. He probably had students do it, but in any case, and what he determined was that almost all federal policy in the United States favors either the wealthy or corporate interests and other interests that are high-level business interests, and that mass groups of individuals have little to no influence on those policies. And furthermore, the result of that has been pointed out by Joseph Stiglitz, who is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and he recently wrote an article in, of all places, the Scientific American, in which he talks about economic inequality, which is a big issue of his in the United States. And he concludes the article by saying there is never going to be a change in economic inequality in the United States until the campaign finance system is changed. And as a person who has been very active in the campaign finance system, both at the state level as well as in the federal government, I'm not too optimistic about a change in the United States, particularly on the federal level. There is a lot of possibility for change in the local level. But let me tell you a little bit about my experience at the Federal Election Commission, and then also talk about the United States Supreme Court, because those are the two reasons. And you're right to talk about enforcement and the importance of enforcement and the importance of having an agency that is dedicated to enforcement, but then you can have an agency that is captured, like the Federal Election Commission was captured. And as a result, they do not perform the functions that they're supposed to perform. And that was what my experience was when I was there. I was chair and commissioner for 3 years, over 3 years. And what I saw was that even though the purpose of the commission is to provide disclosure of all campaign finance expenditures, contributions, and other activities, as well as enforcement, regulating, giving advice to people, the commission didn't do any of those things. And the reason for that was several years prior to my arriving, a previous chair of the Federal Election Commission understood, because there are 6 members of the commission, no more than 3 can be of one political party, and it requires 4 votes to do anything at the commission that is of any substance, enforcing the law or investigating even. That chair recognized that if 3 members of the commission, all of one political party, vote in unison all the time as a block, that they are able to allow nothing to be done at the commission. And it was very successful. During his tenure and subsequently after he left, the same kind of activity continued because his successors all understood what they were supposed to do. And this was done, by the way, in concert with a member of the Senate, the U.S. Senate, one of the people who's regulated by this commission, to assure that there would not be any enforcement. That particular individual, Don McGahn, was later appointed White House counsel, and I was very concerned when I saw that, knowing what had occurred at the commission, because it seemed to me that it was a harbinger of a similar decimation of other regulatory agencies in the federal government under the Trump administration. And in fact, I mean, you referred to the corruption index. The United States has gone precipitously down 4 points, which is more than has happened in probably 20 years, and under the new administration. And one of the reasons has to be, that was suggested, was because there is a lack of checks and balances, and because of the decimation of regulatory agencies in the administration. And just one more note about the importance of campaign finance and the potential of regulation, and also the potential of it being corrupting. Everybody is waiting with bated breath. You are all in Washington. You probably are watching this every second. Fortunately, I'm in California, so I don't have to. But people are waiting for the Mueller indictments. And those indictments that have already taken place, you might know, are all campaign finance violations. Every one of them, it has to do with campaign finance. And there's a big discussion in the campaign finance community about whether or not it's appropriate to have criminal violations for campaign finance violations. And I'm definitely on the side of yes, there should be, because some of these are absolutely central to the undermining of our democratic processes. So we shall see what happens when Mueller ultimately finishes his investigation. But sort of back to the FEC, what has happened there in the last 10 years is that the 3 block of commissioners have prevented even the investigation of any violations that are of any substance. And the way that has happened is that even though the general counsel, who is not partisan, who's independent, their offices have many times recommended that there should be investigations because there was sufficient evidence to show that there were potential violations, and they refused even to investigate those complaints. But even if there was not and just to sort of respond to some of what you've said, it's very difficult for an agency that oversees all the federal offices that are elected to actually ferret out improprieties. You're always dependent on complaints from activist groups, from information from reporters who are looking into these issues. So the press is really important, I think, in providing the information that will allow people to know that things are happening that are improper. It's just not possible for an agency with limited resources to be able to know this kind of activity that is occurring on the federal level. But let's talk about the Supreme Court, because all of this has happened really because the law in the United States has been whittled away by the United States Supreme Court relating to campaign finance. Right after the Watergate scandals, which were definitely campaign finance scandals. There were bags of money brought into the White House, cash, to pay for the burglars. And in those instances, some of that money came from foreign donors, and foreign contributions have always been illegal. Some of the money came from corporate interests and, of course, corporate donations that is provided to a candidate is still illegal in the United States. And so that was illegal money that was provided to the Nixon campaign. But there was no enforcement agency. There was no way to deal with it other than through the press servicing these issues. And after that, Congress enacted a number of laws to clamp down on disclosure of expenditures, disclosure of contributions, as well as all expenditures were limited, as well as contributions. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court, when it finally received the case that was contesting this law, held very clearly and has continuously augmented the holding that while you can have limits on contributions to individual candidates, you may not have contributions on expenditures of any kind that are independent of the candidate. And their rationale, and those of you who might follow the U.S. Supreme Court, they just made it up, was that the rationale was that you cannot corrupt by giving money independently. You can only corrupt if you give money directly to a candidate. Of course, over the years, after Citizens United, when the court even expanded on that ruling, saying that corporations, unions, and other organizations can give money independently and unlimited amounts of money as long as it's not coordinated with the candidate. But there is no definition of coordination, and we all know that there are super PACs and other organizations that actually are closely aligned with candidates, but they receive unlimited amounts of money to work on the campaigns, essentially, but they're side-by-side campaigns. They're not the campaign, but in most cases, they are much larger than the actual campaigns of the candidates. And so there is what is been described as shadow campaigns, and these are essentially the real campaigns of the candidates. There was a very interesting, sort of amusing issue that came up when Carly Fiorina was running for president in the Republican Party, and there was her Carly campaign, and then there was the C.A.R.L.Y. campaign, which actually ran, you can't even make this up, honestly. They had fundraisers for her. They had giant rallies. They had came set up with all materials for her and had balloons, and it was just like what you would think of as a campaign. And then the Carly campaign would arrive and speak. But that other campaign was considered to be independent, and therefore they were able to receive unlimited amounts of money from corporate interests, from any other interests, and actually, in fact, ran the campaign. And there was never any determination, because there aren't any rules that are specific to what coordination means. So as a result, what we have now, and this happened in the 2018 midterm election, which was all Senate and Congress people, that the amount of money spent by the campaigns independently, not the campaigns themselves for the candidate or their committee, was well in excess of the amount of money that was spent by the actual campaigns. And that's become more the tradition in the United States now. And there is another kind of scary statistic, which is that, and this has happened both in the primaries, but also later, that the number of people who have contributed to those super PACs, which give unlimited amounts of money, has been, since I believe it was 2010 until now, only 11 people have given over $1 billion for campaigns. So the number of people who are actually participating in providing the money is very small, and we happen to know who many of them are. But in any case, one of the most concerning part of this is that there are no regulations and no laws about disclosure of some of this money that goes circuitously from some of these independent groups then to other 501c4s or nonprofit groups, 501c6s, business groups. We know, for example, there was, not to pick on Trump by any means, but the Trump campaign received a lot of money, or there was money that got funneled through the first from the NRA, came from Russia, then went to the campaign. This is impossible unless there's, a detective to be able to figure out where the money came from. And since disclosure and transparency is a basis for campaign finance laws, it is obviously not effective anymore, given what the Supreme Court has unleashed in this country.
Terrific, Anne. Let me just stay with you for a second, because I want to take up the theory that Kevin put on the table, which is that in a system, and we threw out Nigeria, I think, just as a potential case study, but in a system where bribery is normalized, then political finance is probably less relevant as a way to purchase influence. I think. Well, I want to ask you if what you're describing is sort of the inverse, right? A system in which there are now so many loopholes in the formal system of spending caps and contribution caps and transparency about who's donating and what's being spent. I mean, the campaigns are still filing every quarter. They're very well accounted for, expense reports and a list of their donors. All of that is still happening. But what you're describing is a pretty extensive kind of system of loopholes. And I guess the question is whether that system of political finance loopholes has become so effective as a way to buy influence that bribery is no longer, outright bribery is no longer necessary, and there are probably other disincentives to doing so. But is that kind of would that be an accurate way to kind of describe the system you're putting on the table?
Yes, that is a very accurate way, because a number of people say that the only people, this money that travels circuitously, ultimately to campaigns, to assist the campaigns, is sometimes called dark money. And many people say it's only dark to the American public. It's not dark to the recipients of the money. They know who's doing independent expenditures on their behalf.
Let's stay on that theme. And Delia, I don't know if the term dark money is used in Argentina, but I was looking at some of the numbers on numbers reported by the press on the last presidential election. So the expenditures by President Macri's campaign, official expenditures were 160 million pesos, and the press reported that he actually spent 1.76 billion pesos. His opponent, Daniel Scioli, said he spent 108 million pesos and actually spent more than 2 billion pesos. And not to sort of pick on Argentina, so there was a study in Mexico, to take another country, by Mexicanos contra la Corrupción y la Impunidad, which estimated that for every peso that entered, that was spent by gubernatorial campaigns, sort of officially, there were 15 pesos that were coming in and being spent sort of off the books. So how does this happen? How does that much money, sort of find its way into campaigns and then get spent? And what's the issue? I mean, are the spending caps sort of artificially low? Is the enforcement and oversight excessively weak? How do we begin to get our heads around this problem and addressing it?
Las regulaciones que nosotros tenemos son, en términos generales, muy buenas, podrían pasar cualquier examen. El tema es que no son realmente aplicadas. Y las cifras oficiales tienen que ver con los maravillosos dibujos contables que los contadores de cada partido ofrecen a las autoridades. Ningún partido va a declarar que ha gastado más de lo que está limitado a gastar, ni que ha recibido contribuciones que exceden los límites o que provienen de fuentes ilícitas. Teóricamente nadie se pondría ese sombrero. Sin embargo, aún en esa circunstancia, y dado que el enforcement de las reglas es débil porque no tiene la capacidad en términos de recursos, no tiene la independencia política suficiente y no tiene el mandato legal necesario para controlar eficientemente, dado que todo eso sucede, los partidos reportan exactamente lo que reciben e incluso lo que reciben oficialmente, digamos, y no se trata de campañas independientes en el caso de Argentina, que utilizan el dinero en negro, que llega en valijas, en cash, sino que son la propia campaña oficial, que en paralelo realiza el gasto real. A pesar de todo esto, hay algunos partidos que, por ejemplo, aun cuando las aportaciones anónimas están prohibidas, reportaron un gran aporte de NN. O sea, declararon que eran anónimas. Y entonces, como era evidente que NN no era el nombre de nadie, el organismo de control les pidió que informaran y entonces tuvieron que dar algunos nombres. El problema en Argentina y en muchos países latinoamericanos no es la falta de recursos para las campañas, sino el problema de lavar los recursos para poder reportar. Y eso se ha visto cuando se entregan listados enormes de personas, generalmente aquellos que reciben planes sociales o que son muy pobres, antes los sacaban directamente del padrón, a los nombres del padrón de electores, que figuran como aportando para poder blanquear el dinero que efectivamente entró a la campaña de lo que se va a reportar oficialmente. Ese dinero entró en valijas de origen que debe ocultarse porque es ilícito, por lo tanto cumplimos la ley formalmente con un listado de personas que no han aportado. Y eso se está descubriendo gracias a que ahora los que investigan financiamiento de la política, como decía Kevin, no son los organismos de control electoral, que no tienen los mecanismos para hacer este tipo de investigaciones de ilícitos, sino la justicia criminal con los fiscales especializados y obviamente el periodismo de investigación que ha descubierto muchas de estas cosas.
Lo que está diciendo Delia es muy importante, pero me trae a la mente una conversación sumamente interesante que tuve yo hace muchos años con el que entonces era la cabeza de la autoridad electoral de Australia, un país muy grande, ¿verdad? Y entonces le pregunto yo cómo hacían ellos, además, ojo, Australia además con un sistema donde hay candidaturas individuales, ¿verdad? ¿verdad? O sea, no es un sistema, digamos, o sea, tienen partidos evidentemente, pero las candidaturas individuales, cada una de ellas tiene una estructura electoral propia. Entonces le pregunté a este hombre cómo hacían ellos para controlar la aplicación, la vigencia de las normas de regulación del financiamiento político que tenían. Y el tipo, la respuesta fue de una gran simplicidad. Me dice, miren, nosotros lo que hacemos, nosotros tenemos muy poca gente. Nosotros tenemos, para dedicarle a esto en un país como Australia, tenemos 9 o 10 personas. Lo que hacemos es aplicar el mismo principio que aplican todas las administraciones tributarias del mundo. Nosotros no tratamos de revisar cada donación. Lo que hacemos es revisar aleatoriamente. Lo que hacemos es aumentar el riesgo de que si usted incurrió en una violación al dar o recibir una donación política, usted tenga una probabilidad mayor de que lo agarren. Entonces, menciono esto porque me parece que se ha generalizado esta idea en las autoridades electorales, que también es una idea, digamos, muy cómoda, de que es muy poco lo que pueden hacer, porque controlar el financiamiento es una cosa dificilísima. No es rocket science tampoco. O sea, realmente tampoco creo que sea rocket science. Y me parece que una de las claves para convertirlo en algo menos que rocket science es aplicar el principio que aplican todas las administraciones tributarias del mundo. Ninguna con más eficiencia que el IRS. Dicho sea de paso.
Pero además...
Let me just jump in just to frame the issue a little bit, and then I want to open up for questions. But the advisory report that you worked on, Eduardo, and Delia as well, for the IDB, recommended a number of reforms in this area. Enhanced transparency of campaign contributions, caps on spending, bans on anonymous and foreign donations, public subsidies for campaigns, as well as stronger penalties and enforcement bodies, which is what Kevin was just alluding to. And I think your reference to the Chilean reform, which is a more holistic one, probably touches on a lot of this. But but just welcome your kind of reactions to what you've heard here, and in terms of that litany of reforms recommended in the report, is there a sequence? Is there a prioritization? Are there things that strike you as kind of more urgent based on the work that you've done?
Okay, so let me first not resist what was being said here. Let me complement what Kevin was adding to Delia. The other thing which also is very efficient or muy eficiente en nuestras administraciones tributarias es hacerlo atractivo para que la gente denuncie, facilitar y proteger a denunciantes. Muchos de los casos más emblemáticos vienen de ahí. En la legislación chilena de 2003 a 2014, los únicos que podían denunciar casos ilegales de financiamiento eran los presidentes de los partidos políticos. La ley se aseguró que ningún ciudadano pudiera hacer eso. Obviamente no hubo ninguna denuncia, porque había acuerdo de caballeros y damas de que no se denunciaban entre ellos. Pero una vez que cambió la ley, ahora sí hay denuncia, por lo tanto la amenaza de denuncias de cualquier ciudadano combinado con una protección debida de esos informantes, es así como se descubren los grandes carteles, etc. Lo que hay que hacer es romper estos malos acuerdos, entonces es un complemento a eso. Given your question, I really don't think there's a recipe for every country. I think the reality is really country specific at a moment in time. You can really not say that. So let me take a topic on which we have disagreed with Delia. I'm sure we still disagree, which is whether non-individuals, so basically companies, should be allowed to finance politics or not. I believe they should not. Delia, I imagine, still believes they should. I think it depends on the country you are and the moment you are. So I think in the long run, I strongly believe you should not, but at a certain situation now in most Latin American countries, the challenges are much more basic than that, and it would be great to have transparency and forget about not having companies in there. And if you have the risk of narco traffic going there, of course, that's much more important. So the important thing here is not a list of how you do it. It is a very good diagnostic of your political possibilities at a moment in time. We have great ideas on what to do, and it gets implemented very rarely because those who are supposed to implement it are the ones who lose power in the process, and no one likes to lose power. So essentially the story is how you make the best of these major scandals to get together a coalition politically with a major role for civil society in terms of pushing these reforms, because it is those scandals that temporarily, transitorily, destroy this veto power which in normal times these Congress and politicians have on these reforms. You must use these scandals in an intelligent way, and not only you will have the society on your side, but you must also then channel this into something much more boring, which is good legislation. And there you need to inform society, to put pressure on legislators. It gets much more technical. You have many things happening at the same time. And definitely, if you think there's one recipe, you're going to get it wrong. You must look at the given moment, the given country, what is realistic, who can support this in this moment, and then do your very best out of it.
So as Rahm Emanuel says, never let a good scandal go to waste. Delia, let me give you the last word and then we'll open it up.
Brevemente, porque con Eduardo discutimos sobre esto y ninguno cambia de opinión. Obviamente no hay ninguna receta que pueda aplicarse en todos los países. En cuanto a la prohibición de los aportes corporativos, mi posición es que prohibirlos absolutamente, como se ha querido hacer y se sigue haciendo como la receta para solucionar todos los problemas, no ha servido nada más que para generar incentivos para que esos aportes se transformen íntegramente en aportes en negro por debajo de la mesa, en valijas que llegan y que después los partidos tienen que blanquear con nombres de personas. O llegan a los partidos con el nombre de los gerentes o los empleados de una determinada compañía para justificar el aporte, y ha habido compañías que han vendido a los partidos el nombre de su nómina para justificar con nombres de los empleados propios la valija con dinero negro que había entrado. El tema es que cuando nosotros buscamos transparencia en el financiamiento de la política, no es por una simple cuestión de curiosidad. Es un elemento que nos permite valorar gestión de gobierno, conflictos de intereses, privilegios ilícitos. Y entonces lo que necesitamos es saber quién realmente ha puesto los fondos. No nos facilita en nada tener una lista de nombres de empresas o de nombres de empresarios, familiares o de los empleados de una empresa, cuando después los contratos de infraestructura o cualquier otro tipo de contrato público lo obtienen las empresas. Hacer el link entre el donante y el que obtiene el beneficio es mucho más difícil si simplemente prohibimos a algunos donantes y facilitamos que todo el dinero entre en negro. Eso ha pasado en muchos países. Brasil prohibió, por ejemplo, los aportes de corporaciones después del escándalo de Collor de Mello y toda la gran regulación que hubo, y terminamos en Odebrecht para prohibir otra vez los aportes de corporaciones.
I'm going to open it up, Kevin, if you don't mind. I'm sure you'll have a chance to jump in. But I know we have a lot of people here who know this issue well. So I'm going to take one question from each side of the room, and then if we have time, we'll do another round. We'll start here. Please introduce yourself and keep your questions brief.
I'm Timothy Towell, 30 years in the State Department, most of it in Latin America, advancing democracy, freedom, transparency, rule of law, and all the wonderful things that this panel has been advancing, and we hope will continue to advance. And my question is, after listening to Anna saying how the United States of America, leader of democracy, freedom, and transparency, was so bad for the last couple of decades, and then when you go back to your hotel and you turn on the TV and watch the White House giving a 2.5-hour speech down the river there, are you gentlemen going to do, ladies and gentlemen, going to go back to Costa Rica, Chile, Argentina, and every place else and advance this wonderful stuff that the Yankees in my time were advancing? Or you're going to say, you can't do it because Anna and Donald Trump says you can't do it, so you're going to go home and have an aguardiente and give up? What are you going to do?
Thank you. Let's go right here.
Ronald McLean de Bolivia, voy a hablar en español. Yo creo que ha sido brillante lo que hemos escuchado esta mañana y ha hecho que Roberto no esté en lo correcto en su introducción, porque creo que ahora las contribuciones privadas casi son irrelevantes después de lo que Delia nos ha develado, que las verdaderas contribuciones en realidad vienen dentro de los propios estados y es plata pública. Eso para mí es fundamental porque hemos visto que para ello se necesitan estados grandes que controlan la economía, necesitan los petrobrases grandes y otras empresas, y el contraste está con Chile. En Chile, fuera de las minas que controla Chuquicamata, la mayoría de los grandes proyectos son privados y no tenemos el problema de corrupción. En el caso de Bolivia, por ejemplo, se ha develado que el presupuesto de comunicación es de $600 millones, que para Bolivia es mucho dinero, que suma más que el presupuesto de educación y salud puestos juntos, y casi tanto como el de defensa. Y lo que ha pasado ahora es que el sector privado simplemente es un facilitador para robarle al Estado, de parte del Estado, de parte de los gobiernos. Entonces creo que hay un cambio sustancial en esto, y por eso que no es casual que sistemas políticos con estados grandes son mucho más corruptos en escala, y el caso de Brasil es el mejor, que sistemas como el chileno, que son mucho más chicos. El Estado es relativamente mucho más chico que estos otros. Entonces, la corrupción en Brasil, Bolivia, de Venezuela o Ecuador ha sido significativamente más grande y coincide con el sistema político. Y para terminar, creo que algo que Eduardo no nos ha comentado, pero que quizás quisiéramos saber mejor, es que Chile tiene un éxito muy grande porque limita el gasto en la política. El gasto en televisión, por ejemplo, que es el más grande en las campañas, en Chile está muy restringido y no importa cuánta plata tengan los partidos, no lo pueden gastar en aquello.
Okay. Let's go to this side of the room in the back.
Hi, Molly Coyle, Brookings Institution. I wanted to ask about a slightly different aspect of campaign finance that was a little bit visible in like El Salvador. They talked a lot about the influence, potential rumored influence of China in the elections and their role in campaign finance. I'd be interested in your opinions on the scope or magnitude of foreign influence of foreign actors on campaign finance in Latin America, if that's really a concern or if this is just something that kind of came up one-off in this election, and how that plays a role.
Start with those, and if we have time, we'll do another round. Maybe we'll start with you, Kevin, since I kept you from from interjecting again before we open up for questions. Go ahead.
Thank you for your questions and comments. And you know, again, I can't resist it. I can't resist it. I'm going to say something before I go into the questions. Delia, el argumento que hacías sobre las contribuciones de las empresas tiene sentido. No sé, fíjate que en Costa Rica, donde las contribuciones de las empresas se prohibieron en el año 2009, fíjate que ha tenido un efecto saludable. Y ha tenido un efecto saludable combinado con otras cosas, ojo, combinado con un sistema de financiamiento público robusto que le da más márgenes, digamos, de autonomía a los partidos, combinado con otra serie de cosas, ha tenido un efecto salutífero. En parte, por lo que vos decías en tu presentación al inicio, porque la mayoría de los empresarios no les encanta la idea de contribuir. Entonces, si les pones todavía una barrera adicional que hace ilegales las contribuciones que dan sus empresas, mucho menos lo hacen. Entonces, por lo menos, digo, para lo que sirva, yo en esto, fíjate que estoy más de acuerdo con Eduardo porque he visto el efecto de la prohibición en Costa Rica y ha sido saludable. Ok, sobre las tres preguntas. Timothy, I don't think there's you should be overly harsh with your own country. I think this is an issue that every single democracy struggles with. I mean, just a few days ago, for something I'm writing, I was sort of developing, it's a half-baked product as we speak, but I was kind of developing an index on political finance regulation. Taking, a whole bunch of measures that different countries do to regulate political finance and then come up with an index. Well, it turns out that some of the most deregulated political finance systems in the world are the Nordic countries. So, you can make whatever you want out of that piece of information, but it tells you that regulation is not everything, on the one hand. It also tells you that even for very proper and nice democracies, they have a hard time regulating this. So, the U.S. is not alone on this one. Ronald's question. Ronald, I can see your point, and it makes sense up to a point. I mean, just as my answer to Timothy is Sweden, my answer to you is Guatemala. I mean, Guatemala is the paradise of a libertarian. I mean, seriously, it's a country that collects 10% of GDP in taxes, where the state doesn't really go beyond the cities. And, well, I would be hard-pressed to say that Guatemala is a corruption-free environment. And I'm trying to be polite here. So, I think it's more complicated than that. Intrusive states might create more incentives for, shenanigans, but it's not just that. An entirely deregulated, an entire environment of deregulation can also create its own set of problems. Foreign contributions. Well, I mean, foreign contributions have always been part of the landscape, of the political finance landscape in Latin America. I mean, think about, all the accusations that were flown about the Soviet Union, giving money to communist parties in Latin America, and all the accusations that, by the way, have, in many cases, found out to be true, of Taiwan giving money to countries all over the region. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. I don't have any direct evidence or insight on this, but I would be surprised if China was not doing the same in perhaps in El Salvador and other countries. It really, I guess, I would like to think that it boils down to a question of enforcement. If you have rules that are more capable of enforcing the ban that pretty much every country in Latin America has in the books on foreign donations, then you might be able to do something about it. Again, I'm not sure how representative this is, but this is something that Costa Rica has done reasonably well. I think foreign donations, private donations in general, have become far less relevant in Costa Rican campaigns over the past generation. And part of that is because the electoral authority has become more capable of enforcing the rules that are in the books. But yet, even though most countries have the ban on foreign donations, you have Odebrecht. That tells you how difficult this is. But I think it's an important issue. The issue of foreign donations.
So, okay, so let's continue with this topic and let's find an agreement on companies and money. I think it's different in Costa Rica and Chile and Argentina, and it's not more than that. I think that's the whole issue, and we might agree. I would not propose it in Argentina. So in Chile, this new reform so far has worked nicely, partly because there's two new political parties that have emerged. They were successful in the last congressional election, one on the right and one on the left, which is also nice. And they discovered that you can run campaigns with little money if you use social media. And they were much more creative than the traditional parties in doing so. They were the first to abide by the new legislation to re-register, which was one of the demands because the padrones electorales were totally fake by now. And it's been working fine. But in Chile, I would not propose that in another country, and the indices used it at the beginning with Uruguay, Costa Rica, and Chile being at a different level than the rest of Latin America. It's part of the reason why the policies are going to be quite different. And in Chile, again, I don't think things like the ones you described in Argentina are happening, at least on a massive scale, in terms that businessmen are financing right-wing parties, and now it's public, and you know how much they give to the parties, and before it was through their companies, and it was not public, even though legal. So I think there's been improvement, and we're not going to give up, Timothy. I think there are things happening which make us optimistic that you can do certain things at certain moments in time. Ronald's comment, I agree with what Kevin said, but the specific example is a nice one, which is, till 2003, Chile had no legislation whatsoever on campaign finance, except a tradition from the very beginning that you could not have political propaganda on TV, and that all you could have was time on TV allocated based on your previous electoral results. So that, in a country which had no legislation, was not a bad starting point, which meant the most influential media for campaigns was restricted and was independent of the money you had, and of course that has continued being so. So I think that is a nice point to make, and good Ronald did. And finally, the China story, and it relates back also to Timothy. Among the many costs of the Trump administration, there's a major cost of the U.S. abandoning a role it did play all over the world in terms of fostering governance and preventing corruption. And this is a topic which China is definitely, at least at this stage, less sensitive to it. And there's a vacuum there, and it's fortunate that this vacuum has been filled to some extent by other institutions. It is absolutely surprising if you told someone who woke up and was sort of asleep for 10 years that the IMF is talking about corruption, that the IMF has considered corruption for conditionality in certain help to countries is something totally new. It's because the IMF realized that the US is not there anymore, the World Bank is not doing its job, and now the IMF is there. There are many others stepping in. The IDB, with the report we participated with, did is another example. So Scandinavian countries as well. So I think that, but there's a major cost there in terms of the U.S. abandoning this, and then China coming in very aggressively in the infrastructure sector, and most likely with less concern for things we believe are important for democracy to work well.
Great. I'm going to turn to Delia and Anne, and maybe just to throw one more issue on the table for you. The issue of public financing of campaigns has come up in a few different guises. These campaigns are really expensive, and that is clearly creating an incentive to sort of find the money from somewhere, oftentimes from sources that aren't particularly clear, and in some cases, extreme cases, from criminal elements. But is public financing, do you think, a kind of critical component of the solution, and how realistic is it in the countries that you're working?
Empiezo con tu pregunta. El financiamiento público debe existir en la medida en que puede facilitar un nivel mínimo de igualdad en la competencia en el origen, para que no sea solo la capacidad de recaudar en el sector privado la que determine las chances de éxito de una candidatura. Pero reemplazar el financiamiento privado completamente por financiamiento público, es decir, prohibir todo ingreso privado, es realmente una solución que no apoyo. Creo que el sistema, y Latinoamérica tiene muchos modelos para hacerlo, debe ser público y privado. No importa si son las corporaciones, si son individuos, si son grandes donaciones, pequeñas donaciones, con qué límites, pero me parece que tiene que haber de los dos. Lo que están diciendo Kevin y Eduardo tiene que ver con el contexto, y yo empecé contándoles que Chile, Costa Rica y Uruguay, que no está aquí, son los únicos 3 países en la región que están por encima de la media en la escala de percepción de corrupción, y no es algo que podamos tener como un elemento simplemente decorativo. Ese es el contexto, esas son las instituciones funcionando, esas son las personas respetando las leyes que se aplican. En un contexto de anomia, como es el de muchos de los países de la región, donde podemos tener maravillosas normas que no se aplican porque son simplemente para poner en los libros y en los anales, entonces la situación es completamente distinta. Y esto tiene que ver obviamente con las prohibiciones y los actores. Yo les mencionaba el nuevo actor en financiamiento de la política, que es el crimen organizado. ¿Alguien cree que a un jefe de un cartel del crimen organizado le hace cosquilla que la ley diga que las contribuciones del crimen organizado están prohibidas? Obviamente no, porque su negocio es actuar en la ilegalidad. Entonces tenemos que tener en cuenta eso. Y creo que la clave es el enforcement, la capacidad de trabajar para descubrir y hacer efectivo los estándares de transparencia y las limitaciones que las leyes ponen. Las leyes son necesarias, pero no son suficientes. Y menciono algunas cosas particularmente en tema de enforcement. La globalización y la tecnología han revolucionado también la circulación del dinero para el financiamiento de las campañas, no solo para el resto de la economía. Y esto debemos tenerlo en cuenta. Nosotros tenemos normas y gran corrupción es un caso que trasciende los límites territoriales de un país. Marcelo Odebrecht declaró en Brasil que había financiado a más de 3.000 candidatos en la región. Esa fue la declaración formal ante la justicia de 11 países en la región y 2 países en África, porque fue transcontinental. Y tan se han transformado en facilitadores de la corrupción que, como señalaba Eduardo, han generado todo un sistema empresarial para el pago de corrupciones y lo que yo les decía, facilitarles el lavado para que el dinero llegue más o menos limpio a los políticos. Una cosa que debemos hacer es trabajar coordinadamente. El organismo electoral, la agencia, el que tenga que controlar el financiamiento, con los otros organismos de control del Estado, las autoridades de impuestos, las autoridades bancarias, las autoridades que investigan lavado de dinero. No puede ser que al organismo de control del financiamiento muchas veces se le oponga el secreto bancario, el secreto fiscal, la confidencialidad de las investigaciones de lavado de dinero. Esto es un Estado que controla un fenómeno que consideramos que debe ser controlado, entonces hay que trabajar al unísono. Las normas de asistencia legal en investigaciones entre diversos países tienen que ser reformadas adecuadamente. La gran corrupción no se puede investigar con normas de cooperación internacional basadas en los sistemas procesales del siglo XIX, que suponen que el juez le manda un oficio al canciller, el canciller al otro canciller, ese canciller al juez correspondiente, el juez lee el pedido de información y dice le falta un detalle, vuelva el recorrido. Obtener la información internacional por esa vía puede demorar años. Mientras tanto, el dinero hoy cambia a la velocidad de un clic en una computadora. Y la tecnología ha aportado otros elementos, como el famoso blockchain. El blockchain que se vende como la forma de solucionar todos los problemas de transparencia. Ese es el eslogan. Todos los problemas de falta de transparencia. El blockchain es lo que está en la base de las cibermonedas. Las cibermonedas están siendo utilizadas en nuestra región y en algunos países del este de Europa como la moneda que utilizan los narcotraficantes y el crimen organizado porque el dinero se mueve mucho más rápido y es imposible trazar la ruta del dinero. Lo que yo decía de que las herramientas no nos sirven. Durante años dijimos follow the money. Esa era la receta. Follow the money and you will find who have given the contribution. Blockchain y las criptomonedas impiden follow the money. Así que hay que tener mucho cuidado con eso.
Thank you. First, I'll answer your question about public financing by responding to you, Timothy. All is not gloom and doom. There is some possibility of change. For one thing, Congress introduced the for the People Act, first act of the new Congress, which includes a lot of democracy reforms, including on gerrymandering and voting suppression and the like, but also campaign finance and transparency, and also relating to public financing. The problem in the United States is most people don't support total public financing. What they support, though, and what a lot of states and local governments have done over the last few years, is transform vouchers that are given to people so that they can contribute to candidates that they like, or small donor financing, in the sense that there's a contribution from the government, but only as long as the individuals also contribute a certain amount, which is intended, and it is really a good idea, actually, because it's intended to require the candidates to actually talk to the people, which they don't tend to do now because they're seeking large amounts of money. And there is also a federal public financing, presidential financing system now. But since President Obama did not take it in his first campaign because it's not enough money to actually do a presidential campaign, and McCain took it then and lost, no one who is a credible candidate ever takes it. And if there was more money in that fund, and there could be, because it was overseen by the FEC and there's a ton of money just sitting there unused, it would be much more effective.
Terrific. I know there are a lot of questions, I'm sure very good ones, still out there. I want to be respectful of people's time. We're already about 10 minutes over. So I'm sure our panelists who have been terrific will stick around for a little while if people want to come up and ask them questions. But I think we should probably close the conversation here. This has been a really fascinating, interesting discussion, tons to take away, and a lot to continue thinking about. So let me again thank the IDB for the partnership, and Roberto, to you and your team for help in organizing. We have another event in this series upcoming, so stay tuned for that announcement. I also want to thank Tamar and Laura and Irene and Elizabeth, my colleagues, for their help. And please just join me in again thanking our wonderful panelists.